So welcome to Spectrum's Personality Disorder and Complex Trauma Echo. My name is Dimi and I'm Head of Workforce Development, and myself and Liv and Eve coordinate these Project Echo sessions. And firstly, before we start, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge any First Australians who may be present. We also like to acknowledge people with lived and living experience of mental ill health and recovery, and the experience of those who support them, including carers and families. The voices of people with lived and living experience inform our work. And finally, for our presentation today, I would like to welcome Jacinta Emery. Her topic today is Let's Look at the Lingo. Why use person-first language? Jacinta is a lived experience consultant and qualified peer worker. She's been working at Spectrum since 2020. And her area of lived expertise includes a diagnosis and recovery from borderline personality disorder, among other co-occurring mental health conditions. Working alongside Spectrum clinical training staff, Jacinta has a strong interest in sharing her lived experience of psychiatric diagnosis and mental health service use, as well as demonstrating the importance of using effective principles of care to improve treatment and recovery for people living with BPD. So welcome, Jacinta, and thank you, and over to you.
Thanks, Dimi.
You're welcome.
I'll just share my screen. Let's see if this goes okay. Okay, so thanks for that. So today I'm going to talk about language, a little bit about why we use person-first language. But first, a little bit of a background. So why do we focus on language so much? And it's because it matters. How we speak about things, how we speak about people matters. The words that we use have varying meanings and interpretations that differ between each person. So it matters what I say, it matters what I think that I mean, and what I think that you hear and what I think that you mean. So the language we use in our work in the mental health industry can be an enabler of empowerment, acceptance and inclusivity, which are recovery-based principles. Or conversely, language can be a powerful driver of negative stereotypes and characterizations, as well as stigma and discrimination. The words we use can break down misconceptions and stereotypes, or it can feed into them and reinforce harmful attitudes and prejudices. At a community level, the words we use shape social perception and attitudes. Using terms that have known negative connotations reinforces and spreads the associated ideas. And I think the more that we talk about how and why certain terms might affect people differently, the more we can understand ourselves and the people that we're working with. Word meaning and association will differ, sometimes quite largely, between mental health clinician and the people with lived experience. How we think and feel about certain words and terms will vary depending on who we are, the experiences that we've had, and how we interpret the world around us. So it's our business to pay attention to the words that we use in our relationships and how they might be contributing to friction or disconnection, and be open to having discussions about what certain words mean for each of us, what associations we might be making, what kind of a problem that this might be causing in the therapeutic relationship, and how we can create shared understandings around how language might be being interpreted and how language could be modified. So BPD carries a lot of negative perceptions by a lot of people. Prejudices, stereotypes, and stigma, I think, are really high with this condition. And I was on the receiving end of this, and it was excruciating. It still hurts. How people spoke about me and the conditions that I lived with mattered really deeply. And it mattered to my husband as well, who supported me. It particularly mattered the language that was used by people working in the mental health sector. Many things that was said to me and how it was said hurt really deeply, and undoubtedly contributed to the challenge of building trust and safety with services. I was sort of really frequently activated and hurt by insensitive language or hurtful language. And it did make it really hard to feel genuinely supported and genuinely safe. And I sort of felt like services who employ people who speak about people like me in a manner that feels degrading or stigmatizing or sort of, to me, disdainful, weren't safe services. You know, that's how it felt. And I think it prolonged my suffering and really hindered my recovery. So that's why I think we need to be safe for people, and we have to be empathic. And I think the way that empathy is conveyed is mostly through the language that we're using. So this is what's interesting about something that I learnt about just recently, which describes something called accurate empathy. Dr. Gordon Thomas pioneered in effective communication skills. He was a student of Carl Rogers, whose life work advanced the understanding in accurate empathy. The book Listening Well, The Art of Empathic Understanding, that's by William R. Miller, is a beautiful book, and it provides this lovely diagram of Dr. Thomas's work. The text that goes with it in the book is as follows. Before someone speaks or otherwise communicates, there is a hidden meaning. It is what's happening in the person's mind and heart at the moment, set against the background of a lifetime of experience. And that is box A. I think you should be able to see my little arrow there on the lower left, and it's marked meaning. Next, there's box B, and this is what a person says, or the spoken words. If communicating by email or text, the words are all you get. In person, however, we do say much more than is apparent from the words in the transcript, but for simplicity, the upper left box refers to spoken words, but there is more involved. Now, over on the right-hand side of the diagram, this represents the listener. A first step to get the words right, to hear what the speaker actually said, is box C. These are the heard words. And finally, there's box D on the lower right, also labeled meaning. Here, the listener interprets what they've heard, asking, what does the speaker mean? And see, there's arrows here. These arrows indicate where communication can go wrong. Number one, everyone knows that people don't always say precisely what they mean. And in fact, any utterance contains only a small part of the rich inner experience from which it emerged. Number two, the listener has to hear what is said, and hearing what is said can be hindered by many factors. And number three, this requires decoding what the speaker meant, which can be an abundant source of misunderstanding. The listener quickly and mostly unconsciously runs each word through an inner dictionary of possible meanings, and from past experience, assembles an interpretation of what was meant. By this time, box D can be very different from box A, yet the listener may respond as though box D is box A. So I think this really highlights how many steps the process of being empathic has to go through to be accurately received by the listener. And so I think because it's language that we use to be empathic, right? That how the words that we use and how we use them will matter. The receiver needs to be able to interpret what we really mean. And if the language that we're using is not quite attuned, it will be a bit mismatched and they may not be able to pick that up. Language is something I think about a lot, and we could spend a lot of time talking about it. But for today, I did decide to focus on just one language principle in particular that I don't think is particularly controversial, and one that I think we would probably have all heard about and we probably all use already, and that is person-first language. I think discussing why this particular language principle matters might provide a bit of perspective that can apply a little more broadly as well. But before I dive in, I want to make a note that today I'm making a bit of a distinction between diagnosis-first language and person-first language, where diagnosis and identity are considered separate to each other, but I'm not making a case against the use of identity first language where it's preferred, because for some individuals, an identity first language is preferred and entirely appropriate. So this is a quote from the Australian Human Rights Commission that you may be familiar with. And it's first and foremost, people with a mental illness are people, and therefore it is important to use people first language when referring to a person with a mental illness. Person first language is a type of linguistic prescription which puts a person before a diagnosis in a statement or sentence. It describes what a person has and avoids labeling what a person is. In recovery-oriented practice, our aim is to convey that a person is not defined by their diagnosis, that people can recover and that people can live meaningful, contributing lives regardless of diagnosis. When we use person-first language, our attention is focused on the individual first. We're referencing that this is a person we're talking about right now, a person that we're treating, a person we're supporting, a person who experiences pain and suffering, a person who deserves dignity and respect, a person with rights, and a person who has strengths and goals and desires, just like everyone else, which can get so lost between mental health system and person, as we've heard through countless lived experience testimony. So when we're using person-first language, we say a person living with BPD or a person living with borderline personality disorder. And I don't know about you, but when I hear this phrase, my mind makes a connection to three elements, right? So a person, I'm a person, you're a person, it's inclusive. It encompasses both you and me as equal people in this world. And living with, this person lives, they're living with things, lots of things, and this one thing in particular, and it affects their day-to-day. The state of living involves many different aspects of life, and this is one part. And BPD, and this will mean whatever it means for you, plus the fact that this person is living with this. Perhaps your understanding of BPD is limited. Perhaps it's shrouded in stereotypes and negative perceptions, or perhaps it isn't. What matters is that our understanding and perception of BPD matters to the people we work with, and our language needs to demonstrate this. You could also be using a person with a diagnosis of BPD, and I like this because the person is the whole in this sentence, and then having with the diagnosis, it's like that's a part. I think using language this way directs our attention to the real person and the decisions that we make, the attitudes that we express, and the intentions that we have would be more in touch with their needs and their rights. And so these are examples of the diagnosis first language. And even when used warmly and endearingly, this way of referring to people should have attention. It might mean something acceptable to the person saying it, but it does not mean something acceptable to people with lived experience. When the focus is on a diagnosis, it brings with it an immediate draw to negative perceptions that we may have, and the stigma and self-stigma associated with the condition. And, you know, I think there's something a bit problematic about the way that we take people who are struggling to develop a strong sense of self and identity and then characterize them by this diagnosis, and this diagnosis in particular. It has an impact on people. It had an impact on me. And it's our role to reduce that if we can, or where we can. So if you hear it, don't be afraid to speak up. So I've added these little slides in here, these links in here, because these slides will be available to everyone. Because I think these are really good resources. I think they're particularly helpful because they provide a lot of commentary around, a lot of explanation around different word uses and different alternatives, and a bit of the whys and hows. And they're really straightforward guides as well. So as a final note, keep thinking about language, keep reflecting and stay curious about it. It promotes more inclusive, safer services for people living with BPD. We are people first and foremost, and no one should be defined or characterized by their difficulties or by their diagnosis or by a single aspect of who they are. What something means to you may not mean the same thing to the person you're working with. If it comes up, take the opportunity to model some of the therapeutic principles that we've all learned about. Talk about it, explore it, be validating. If you discover that something about your language appears to be causing a disconnect, and then get curious about why. What does it mean to you? What does it mean to the person? And what would be a better way to talk about it? Be authentic, be accepting, be non-judgmental, and be empathic. Thank you.